l'examen de littérature, il aura lieu avant les vacances de Noël. D'accord? Je ne sais pas si vous étiez au courant, mais du coup, voilà, prenez vos mesures. C'est tout. Je pense que vous savez que vous avez de toute façon tout 501, tout 502 qui a lieu avant les vacances de Noël. Théorique. Autre chose, est-ce qu'il y a des personnes qui ont fait de devoirs d'entraînement? Je récupère à mon billet. Merci.
Aujourd'hui. Ah oui, oui, oui. Je pas suivre.
Normalement, c'est dans quelle façon légalement on puisse les examens de semaine. Au moins la semaine prochaine, vous les aurez fait. C'est obligé. Vous pouvez me demander au niveau des dates d'examen. Normalement, nous, on a une obligation légale que vous ayez les dates 2 semaines à l'avance. Donc, vu que la semaine prochaine, on est en semaine 11, que les examens ils ont lieu en semaine 12, vous devriez recevoir les dates, je pense, soit cette semaine, soit la semaine prochaine. Voilà. Nous, je sais qu'on est en train de fixer les dates des oraux et qu'on a quasiment toutes nos dates. Une fois que ça s'est fixé, ça peut être envoyé aux étudiants. Voilà. Il y a eu des petits problèmes en fait cette année parce qu'il y avait un problème de calendrier. Sur un calendrier, c'était noté que le samedi c'est parti des examens et sur un autre, c'était pas noté. Et il y a des étudiants qui ont fait valoir ça par rapport à certaines dates d'examen, donc ça a un petit peu compliqué les choses. Voilà. Alright. So this week we are continuing our work on remembering Babylon, and I asked you at work to read this article. Peter Otto Forgetting Colonialism. And I asked you to try to summarize some of the main ideas or to see what could be useful for an analysis of remembering Babylon in this. What is it that you underlined? Maybe what is it that you didn't understand? We can also speak about this article. What were some of the main ideas that you underlined?
He said that he turned what was political into something psychological.
Yep. Okay, so he's got this whole argument that what is political is turned into the psychological. What is he referring to in particular when he says this? What's he referring to? Just so you guys really understand what he means by this. What's political and what is being transformed, that is being transformed into the psychological for him? De quoi il parle exactement quand il parle de cette transformation du politique en psychologique? C'est son argument principal, mais qu'est-ce qu'on peut inclure là-dedans qu'il y a dans le roman?
Well, he talked about the effect of colonization. When we try to translate these elements, they try to translate it from political into a psychological things, and then he comes to the structure that Malcolm used for the remembering Babylon was romanticism.
Yeah.
And then for him, romanticism, he used Jimmy, for example, as a child, because in romanticism, child represents the balance between two worlds.
Yeah.
It was hard to understand some part, but I thought, and then about the narrative, the style of narrations in this book was redemptive.
Yeah.
Something like that. People remembering Jimmy to heal their, futures.
Okay. All right, there's quite a lot of elements. As you said, dimension of things. As you said, this is what he argues is that this is mostly done through the child-like figure of Jemmy and the importance of childhood in the book. You remember right at the end when you've got Lachlan and Janet, whose sister Monica, when they speak with each other, they keep going back to the moment with Jemmy. They keep going back to their childhood, and you've got childhood as this moment of innocence. So I think you've got a couple of references to Wordsworth there, to the importance of childhood. The child as not being spoilt, if you want, by social norms, by social obligations and restraints. So the child as being a purer sort of being. Okay, so he's interpreting the very childlike nature of Jemmy through this, as you said. And as you said, there's also the redemptive dimension, the fact that all of this is I guess this is the theme of reconciliation that we were talking about last week. The fact that you've got a dimension of healing in the novel, trying to get to terms with the different communities. Okay? So as you said, we can consider that what is around colonialism is not really political in the novel, it's psychological. What else did you find, or how else do you understand the political, psychological dimension?
Jemmy, well, I think I understand that. Is that Jemmy sort of embodies a modern Australia identity, because at some point he said that the identity lays on the border. It's where white settlers' civilization meets the Aboriginal one and the original one, and that gives you modern Australia. Yes.
Okay, alright, so Jemmy as a figure of modern Australia with the mix between the two cultures. Jemmy is often referred to, we'll speak about this more next week, but he's often referred to as a hybrid figure. He's not fully white and he's not fully black. That is, originally he's white, but he's lost, or he's unable to retreat, to get back all of the attributes of a white person, and he also has lots of attributes of black people. So he's this figure, he's a bridge in a way in the novel. He works as this connecting point between the two communities. He's the one that allows the children to actually understand, know things about Aboriginal culture. Okay, so he really represents this in-between figure that could represent a form of reconciliation, of bringing together black and white in Australia. Okay?
One part I didn't really understand was about the word of imagination for, children, and the word physical word for adults, and he stays between them.
I'm not sure what part you're referring to.
It was about a part of imaginations. Jimmy refers as a child, that he has imaginations.
Do you know what page?
I think it's that part. The next, what? The closest model for the character, the next. I think at the end.
This the thing about the idiot boy.
Yeah.
I think this is more about the intellectual characteristics of Jemmy and the fact that he's got very limited intellect. Well, at least the point about the idiot boy is this, and this is where he develops it. I'm not sure if you've read that poem. The idiot boy is about. Okay. The idiot boy is pretty much is a Wordsworth poem that's about a boy that's idiot, and you've got a dimension of the sublime, because through the boy's stupidity he's able to access nature and to be in contact with people more easily than when you're extremely, refined, civilized, sophisticated. This is where you've got obstacles basically between you and nature. So the argument he's making is that the idiocy, because Jemmy is in certain ways a bit stupid, that the idiocy there is a romantic trope. This is something that can be debated. Maybe you don't consider this to be a romantic trope, but this is what he's arguing. And I guess this is what you refer to, this idea here, that you've got a remembering of child and adult, past and present, blah blah blah. Wordsworth's poem mourns the adult loss of the child's imagination through socialization, yet affirms that the child's imagination is still present to the adult through recollection and memory. So I think this is what he's saying here, the fact that you've got the child's imagination that is something extremely precious, and this is a lot of what Remembering Babylon focuses on, the fact that socialization detaches you from your imagination. This is, you know, you can compare this to what happens to Lapland and the fact that he's very close to Jemmy, and then he feels this sort of peer pressure to stop hanging out with Jemmy because he's got the other boys that are finding this a bit strange. So he detaches himself from Jemmy, and we can feel that by the end of the novel that he kind of regrets this, that socialization forced him to let go of this creative dimension of his childhood. And I think you've got this idea that remembering, recollecting, memory is what allows us to connect back to our inner child, sort of. So obviously this is part of the title. So you've got the idea of memory that's very present. You see?
Yeah.
I really want to go back on this point of the political into the psychological, and to make sure that you guys understand where we can see this happening in the novel. What are some of the instances where you find that the political is erased in Remembering Babylon, or moments when things are presented in a more psychological rather than political way?
Right at the beginning, when Jimmy is standing on the fence.
Okay.
It's a symbolic moment because he embodies the hybrid figure. So he's not completely white, but he's not an Aborigine either. It's like as if Australia created something new.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's standing right in the middle. And I think that the settlers are afraid to recognize themselves in him, and they want to keep a certain distance as well. But we can see, like for instance with George Abbott, the teacher, that sometimes he wants to reach to get closer to him in a way, because he wants to have a new understanding about Australia and the people who live in it. So the fence is like, it's almost like a pattern that appears in the novel throughout the entire story.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the fence as being symbolic of this separation. Okay, that works quite well. If you think about it in Remembering Babylon, this is about colonial Australia, and you do have an Aboriginal figure, but it's not an Aboriginal figure. So Jemmy works as the Aboriginal figure, but you don't have any Aboriginal figure in this context of colonialism. So it is about this, but you don't have the right figures in a way. So this is what, the title of this article is very telling of what Otto sees as being the problem with this book. Forgetting colonialism, the fact that in this work, even though you're speaking about a frontier settlement, you don't actually have any presence of Aborigines. And he also shows that there's a whole dimension of anxiety around Aborigines, but Aborigines are never really there. What he's arguing is that basically in Remembering Babylon, you have no representation, no acknowledgement of frontier violence. D'accord? Quelque part, la relation avec les aborigènes dans le roman, elle est juste fantasmée. D'accord? C'est un peu comme la réaction des gamins quand il y a Jamie qui arrive et ils font oh, après tous ces avertissements, il y a enfin un aborigène qui arrive, etc. Il y a cette espèce de paranoïa dans le settlement sur l'arrivée des aborigènes, mais les aborigènes ne sont jamais là, en fait. D'accord? Donc le colonialisme, il n'existe jamais tel qu'il a été dans le roman. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne parle pas des raids, on ne parle pas des attaques, on ne parle pas des contacts, il n'y a rien, il y a juste cette présence un peu énigmatique des aborigènes qui est représentée dans le roman à travers le personnage de Jerry, qui n'est pas aborigène, mais qui les représente. D'accord? Donc ça aussi, ça peut être considéré comme étant problématique ou comme étant au contraire une façon intelligente d'en parler. Mais vous voyez qu'en fait, par exemple, ce dont parle The Secret River, qui est les massacres potentiels qui ont eu lieu, la violence, tout ça, ça n'existe pas dans Remembering Babylon. Ça reste au niveau du fantasme. D'accord? C'est presque, on dirait presque que les colons, ils fantasment l'existence des aborigènes là-dedans. D'accord? Parce que les aborigènes n'existent pas, il n'y a pas de contact, il n'y a pas de présence, il n'y a rien. Okay, so this is pretty much what Otto discusses in terms of the lack of presence of colonialism. The other thing, of course, if you think about it, Remembering Babylon is the story of villagers' reactions to Jemmy and their paranoia about what Jemmy is doing in the village, whether he's a traitor, whether maybe he works as a sort of spy for Aborigines, whether he's just plain stupid. It's people thinking psychologically, basically about the role of this one character. Okay, so this is what he means by translating the political into the psychological, because the reality of colonization would have been violent, or maybe not, but encounters between settlers and Aborigines. And here you don't have any encounters. The only one encounter you have is with a non-Aboriginal character. This character is extremely romanticized. Okay, you've got a very deep psychological reflection on his own mistreatment, the fact that he's a child figure, the fact that he's idiot as well, the sublime dimension of this, his connection to the landscape. So you've got Jemmy as almost a sublime character that crosses both worlds, but you don't have any of the political dimension of colonization. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's not confrontational. Alors après, Otto, il n'est pas content. Hein. Moi, je vous fais lire des choses pour vous réfléchir, vous permettre de réfléchir au roman. Vous n'êtes pas forcément obligé d'être d'accord avec ce qu'il dit. Vous pouvez, il n'y a pas écrit quelque part qu'un roman sur un settlement au 19e siècle, il est obligé d'écrire de manière politique sur la colonisation. D'accord? Il se trouve quand même qu'ils interviennent dans un contexte qui est politiquement chargé et que le choix de ne pas faire intervenir ces histoires-là, il est réel. D'accord? Donc c'est à vous de voir si vous trouvez que c'est une bonne idée d'aborder ces questions-là à travers le psychologique, parce que ça permet de réfléchir en des termes moins chargés, peut-être en des termes plus nuancés sur la colonisation que par exemple ce que peut faire The Secret River. Mais c'est à vous de voir un peu où vous vous situez. D'accord? Si vous trouvez que quelque part la figure de Jamie c'est a prop, d'accord? C'est a literary device, he has a function, whether he's actually managing to get something across through this hybrid bridging figure, or if you feel that this is Malouf basically avoiding the big issue. Okay, it's Malouf avoiding the elephant in the room. It's up to you to see how you feel that this is working. Yeah.
He's actually, at some point, is, I think, quite cleverly talking about the negation of Aborigines by settlers, the fact that they sort of blend them from the picture. It's with Ellen McIver, when she feels she's quite anxious because of the lack of ghosts, and she says that they're gonna be the first to be buried in this land and stuff. So they're completely forgetting the fact that no, they're not the first people to live and die there. But it's sort of they're removing them from the picture. But it's not obvious, and it's, as you said, he's avoiding an elephant in the room, but I think it was quite clever.
But, you know, just like Grenville refused to have Aboriginal characters speak because she felt that she could not reproduce the languages, and if she had broken English they would sound stupid, so she didn't want them to speak. I think that's what Malouf basically chose to do, to avoid Aboriginal characters, to avoid issues over this. But, you know, that's the whole issue. Should you avoid representing those? How can you represent those? Can you represent them appropriately through Jemmy? Is this a clever ploy? Up to you to see how you read this, pretty much. Okay, so remember this section section, you've got a number of sections that repeat this idea, okay? That displaces the second set of recollections by translating the political into the psychological, matters of history and politics into questions of creativity and aesthetics. Okay? And you've got this that is being said again, the erasure of the political in remembering Babylon, and in particular the use of the sublime to orchestrate his remembering of colonialism. Now, if you remember, this is actually something we've talked about in connection to Judith Wright, and the fact that she uses a romantic aesthetic, and that this, in a way, limits the impact of the violence of colonization on the reader. Okay? I think we worked on a quote that said, well, the romantic aesthetic anesthetizes the reader to the violence of the colonizing process. Okay? So you can see that you've got similar issues that are being developed, and I think we can even see this happening in The Secret River, the romantic dimension of the land, the romanticization, idealization of settler life, in particular of Thornhill, etc. So you can think about this idea of the romantic and the connection to the political, whether they're connected or all of this together. Let me see, we're good. Okay. Did you guys understand the thing about the title? This is what he starts with, trying to explain the title. Yeah.
He makes the analogy that it could be the same for the Australian society.
Yeah, pretty much. Hey, you need to keep this in mind, that the title can be interpreted in lots of different ways. This is one way of interpreting it. You've got two different epigraphs at the beginning of the novel that basically try to point you to this. You've got a reference to William Blake, and then you've got a poem that's about remembering and memory. So you can see that there is, to Maloof, at least in the way that he chose these epigraphs, he's positioning memory as something really central in the novel. Okay, so keep this in mind. As you said, you've got the idea, this is what he explains at the beginning, that you've got a reference to Blake's Babylon, which is a city formed by the dismemberment of Albion. Okay, so you've got this idea here, si on lit ensemble. The allusion suggests that colonial Australia is a dismembered Albion. D'accord? En gros, une Angleterre fragmentée en des endroits, enfin des lieux coloniaux, d'accord? Et qu'ensuite il y a la possibilité de tout réunir. Formed by successive waves of transportation and migration. If the scattered pieces of Albion's body could be put back together again, then, according to Blake, Babylon would become Jerusalem once more, and Albion would rise from the grave. Okay, so you can see that he says the book remembers the divisions of colonial Australia, not to reconstruct an imperial Albion, but to build a new Jerusalem of Australian national identity. Okay, so you can see that he's using this idea of Australia being part of a dismembered England in a way, a smaller, a small dimension of England far away in the Pacific that could constitute itself as a Jerusalem. If you remember, when we spoke about Judith Wright, we compared Babylon and Zion, and here it's the same. You pretty much have a comparison in the verse, the line that is quoted from Blake, between Babylon and Jerusalem. Okay, so Jerusalem being seen as this ideal city of harmony, and Babylon referring to dismemberment and division. Okay, so if you take the line by William Blake, whether this is Jerusalem or Babylon, we know not, is the idea of potentially whether Australia should be considered as a multilingual space that is going to fall apart, as Babylon did, or if it's an ideal place of unity. Okay, so you can see that you've got this idea of bringing the population together or not. Just reminding you that Babylon refers to the city that was where people all spoke the same language, where that was harmonious, and then the inhabitants decided to build a tower, the Tower of Babel, that tried to reach the skies. And God, being angry at this idea of them trying to reach the sky, punished them by bringing them a diversity of languages and therefore stopping communication. It's the heart of this idea is language and communication. Vraiment, quand on parle de Babylone, c'est toute l'idée de la langue, de la communication, de l'impossibilité de la communication, ou au contraire, de la facilitation de la communication. So, when you take the title Remembering Babylon, of course you've got the idea of memory, but you also have this idea of language, of communication. How is Australia represented in this? Is it represented as a place where language and communication are taking place, or on the other hand, where the community is fragmenting because of too many differences? And you can see that Jenny, as a bridging figure, is the one that has the potential to enact Jerusalem in the novel. Okay? Whether or not this takes place is another question. Ça va? Article, any sections that you're not too sure to understand, or that you'd like us to have a look at together? Alright, let's take a minute to think about the sublime in Remembering Babylon. So remember, the sublime is about the beauty of nature and awe and the power of nature. Potentially as well, characters that are going to have a special connection with nature. A special connection, communication with nature. So take a couple of minutes and try to think about what in the novel can be considered to be a representation of the sublime. idea that there are spirits and that there are deeper sort of meanings and things to be read in nature that are not accessible to white settlers. And in fact, when Jemmy's showing plants to Mr. Fraser, he's not actually telling everything that he knows. So he's hiding a bit of knowledge, he's refraining from explaining everything that he knows. So he is sharing a little, but he's also keeping some sort of specificity. So what is associated with the sublime, as you said, is pretty much the Aboriginal worlds, and Jemmy that takes part, that knows this Aboriginal world. You do have this dimension. What else would you associate with the sublime in the novel?
Maybe the Aboriginal, the Aborigines, the fact that they are often referred to as a part of nature.
Yes.
That they are often observers, and they are danger. There is danger in the way. Because the settlers are afraid.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I guess we're not having a look at sections in detail, but it's true that when you look at the few moments when Maloof refers to Aboriginal people, he blends them in the landscape almost completely. So he refers to them as being part of the forest, as being invisible. They're almost completely fused with nature in the novel. So it's true that in that sense you can definitely consider them to be part of the sublime. They're part of this much larger world outside of the settlement that's not controlled, that is unknown, that contains a myriad of meanings. Okay, so definitely that works quite well. What else?
Chapter 15, Janet's epiphany with the bees.
Yeah.
It's as if she found God through a connection with the bees.
Yes. The bees are very much part of the sublime in the novel. They're a very, very important dimension of this. What do you make of the episode with the bees? They're a bit weird, yes. How did you read them, or how did you interpret them? As you said, there's a sort of connection with God through the bees for Janet. What else do you remember about the bees? What are they associated with in the novel? Or more generally? Yeah. Yeah, you've got the idea of the bees as being an angel surrounding her in particular when they're in a swarm. That's what they saw. So you've got lots of religious or spiritual, if you want, connections with the bees, the angels, God, the sort of spiritual presence. What else do you make with the bee? Do you make of the bees?
It's when you read the passage about the bees, it's like a world within the world. It means that you have a lot of. It's not, as you said, not a violent book, but it's quite negative because it's in the middle of these issues with whether Jamie has been visited by Aboriginal people or so, and you have this sort of heaven, of bees, and everything around stops, and you concentrate on bees and on the fact that they're working together, and it's a peaceful environment. It's very calm. When the children arrive to the hives, Mrs. Hutchins sort of stop them, saying it's silence or be calm or something. You're gonna excite them. So it's a very calm world within the world that struggles.
Yeah, pretty much it's actually described as the other world in the novel, in particular at the end. And as you said, it's a different world with different rules, and when people enter it, they're supposed to, well, basically submit to it. This is what you have with Janet and the bees. She basically has to submit to the swarm. She has to stop, trying to get rid of the swarm. She has to accept the swarm on her. Okay, yeah, definitely it's another world. What are some of the characteristics of the bees world that are developed in the novel that you might associate bees with? Love talking about bees. What's the characteristic of bees, like, generally? Yeah. So we've got the idea of community working together, the separation of tasks for a harmonious whole. So you have this dimension. There's also the idea, I'm not sure if you did this, apparently they no longer do this. When I was finishing high school in philosophy, they always started the first philosophy classes talking about bees' language. We don't do this anymore, it must have been old-fashioned. But apparently bees have a very sophisticated way of communicating, and you know, they go to flowers, and when they come back to the hive, they can actually communicate where the good flowers and the good pollen is by doing a sophisticated dance. So the bees, the world of the bees is also associated with communication and language, a unique form of language, very sort of efficient language. So again, you know, when we're speaking about Babylon and we're speaking about communication, the bees are actually part of this theme, being an example of a, not perfect, but of a harmonious society of individuals working together and communicating properly to get things done. Okay, so this other world that Janet gets lost in, because at the end, what she does is she becomes a nun, so she retires from society to dedicate her life to the bees. Okay, so she chooses that world, basically. Okay, so you can see that you've got, yes, a representation. At the end, you've got Lachlan, who obviously is a politician who's gone into politics, so he represents that side of Australian society. And then you've got Sister Monica that's been trying to open a door to another form of language, to another form of communication. And I'm not sure if you followed at the end in the last chapter, but basically she was accused of communicating with the enemy because she exchanged letters about the language of bees, their way of communicating, and it was believed that she was trying to get messages across to the enemy. Okay, so again, you can see that you've got this whole theme, this whole connection between bees and communication that is set up in the novel, that is developed all the way till the end. So I propose that we have a look at some of the specific passages where you've got the bees, because even though it sounds very strange, these are actually very important in the novel. So there's one long passage, the passage of the Epiphany, where she gets surrounded by the swarm. Alors je pense pas qu'on ait les mêmes numéros de page, moi c'est page 128 à 131. En gros, c'est quelques pages avant le chapitre 16. D'accord? Donc si vous avez, soit vous avez les mêmes pages que moi ça commence with came often. After that. Et puis ensuite ça va jusqu'à la fin du chapitre. Ça va? Si vous n'avez pas de bouquin. Et puis ensuite, qu'est-ce qu'on se fait après? On se brave. Alright. Donc ça c'est la super scène de l'épiphanie avec les abeilles. Vous avez tout ça? Ça va? Jusqu'à la fin, jusqu'au début du chapitre 16. Je vous laisse lire tranquillement. Essayez de regarder un petit peu ce à quoi les abeilles sont associées et bien sûr le sublime dans ce moment-là. C'est parti.
parvenus. So, what do you make of the bees in this? What are they associated with? What's the relevance of this section? What do you-
The idea of the agents of the higher power.
That they're what, sorry?
The agents of the higher power.
Yeah.
That shows the genesis.
Yeah, okay, so you've got this idea, it's never clearly stated what sort of higher power. I guess we can suspect God, we can also suspect, a more fundamental sort of, spiritual entity. Perhaps, if you want, you can take it as an abstraction of nature of the Australian land or something. Whatever you want, really. But pretty much they're supposed, as you said, they're supposed to represent a higher power. What else did you notice in this passage about the bees? So they're an image of a higher power. What else are they associated with? Rien qui vous a choqué dans le passage.
They can be associated with life as well because they produce something. So that's why I would link them more with sort of nature,
Yeah. Okay.
nature, spirituality, something like dream time.
Okay.
Something like that. So they're more agent. Well, they're probably agent of God in this passage because then she becomes a nun. But
Yes.
probably more with. I would link them more with nature, with like the nurturing nature.
Okay. It's true that they are producing, honey. They're producing things, so you can look at them in that way as agents producing things. The power of transformation that they have from pollen to honey. What's the significance of this moment in Janet's life? What changes? Or what's the symbolism of this moment?
symbolize the opening of the eyes, actually.
The what?
The opening of the eyes. The opening of
Okay,
the eyes.
sorry,
The whole image of the bees going through the skin and then breaking and going everywhere. Just like some kind of filter in front of her that just goes away, actually.
Yeah, definitely. She's described it after it. As you said, she's got a crust. She's got like basically a layer of bees that covers all of her body. And so when the bees leave, she feels that she's got new skin, that she's got a different perception of life. So this is a very clear symbol of rebirth, where she's reborn or she's regenerated or transformed by the bees. Okay, and you can see that she feels completely different. She feels older than Mrs. Hutchins. She feels that she's moved on to another world. She's understood things. And I'm not sure if you picked it up, but at the end, it's because she sees on Jemmy's face that he recognizes that something has changed. Okay, those final words that you have at the end of the chapter. She saw it, when she met his astonished look, and was what convinced her through Jemmy's eyes. Okay, so here she feels that she's different, but the legitimation, the confirmation that she's different comes from Jemmy. It's Jemmy as the sort of indigenous representative, or at least the person that's closest to nature in the book, that legitimizes her new understanding of her, and he's completely astonished by what's taken place. Okay, so she reads that through him, and he's the one actually confirming that change in her eyes. Okay, so there's a very strong connection between her and Jemmy after this. The fact that they feel they've shared this moment, they've got this shared understanding of a change that's taken place in her life. I think this is an important passage. You've got lots of elements that are quite important in the novel. You can see in there that the bees are described, as we said, as another life, that they've got their side of things. You've got the idea that they're a communal mind, okay, and that she gave a shape, a bodily shape, to the bees. I think there's an emphasis most of the time in Remembering Babylon when they're evoking the bees, the idea that you've got multiplicity that has a single mind, that has a single purpose, and that work together towards the same goal. They're pretty much a figure of harmony in multiplicity, okay, with the unity of this. She speaks in particular about the single vibrant word that they speak, okay, so basically the buzzing sound that the bees are going to make, but you can see that they're really a symbol of unity. Obviously, the bees here work as a symbol of the sublime because they're scary and they're powerful. Okay? It works quite well. She's surrounded by the bees. There's that power, and the only thing she can do is to actually accept her own weaknesses and to surrender to it. If she tries to get rid of the bees, she's going to be stung. So she kind of has to accept to be initiated in a way by the bees that are supposed to be the agents of this larger power. There are also all sorts of weird images. I'm sure you saw them of her being the bride of the bees. Okay, so this is part of the weirder dimension of things. But you can definitely take this into account. She does become a nun, so this is the symbolic wedding of her to God or to a higher faith, and this is done through the bees. Okay, so the bees stand as a spiritual religious symbol, and it's that moment when she chooses to basically only stay with that other life that she describes. There's also there are a couple of other things to mention. The fact you're being told that she, later on, she would start to know all the bees, and that she would start to hybridize the bees and to create bees. So you also have her being a creator of something. And there are other sections in the novel where you've got references to the bees, and she says it's like peering into the city of God. That is, from your perspective as a human looking into the bees, you can observe the whole world, and therefore you can observe it as a spiritual entity would be, if they exist, would be observing our world. Okay, so you do have this dimension of her being submitted to a larger entity, but also her becoming, in a way, a creator in her work with the bees as a nun later on. And of course, what they mention about the fact that she survives this moment is supposed to be about her faith. Okay, so she says that she can see Mrs. Hutchins did not believe. She did believe that things were going to be okay, and that's what saved her. So you can also see this as being her accepting to be a nun and choosing that life because this is what saved her, and she feels that this was almost a divine intervention in a way. Now, this is... Comment on va dire ça? This is actually a very important section in the novel, in the sense that if you think about it, at the end, the only characters that are remaining are basically Janet and Lachlan. You've got Jemmy that's disappeared, that was probably killed. We don't exactly know how, possibly in a massacre against Aborigines, but there's no clear evidence of where he's gone. But Jemmy has disappeared. We've got no Aboriginal figures, and the two that remain to speak about the past are clearly two white Australian figures. You've got Lachlan representing political and social life, and you've got Janet representing a more spiritual dimension. The important thing to mention, if we think again about the political dimension in Remembering Babylon, is the fact that Janet, in a way, is almost accepted by nature. She's adopted, she's chosen by nature in that moment. In a way, a lot of people have commented on this moment as her being indigenized. That is, she's being accepted into Australian nature at this moment, and she becomes, if you want, Australian, truly Australian at this point, because she's been adopted by the bees, because she's going to work in that. Okay, so you can see that at the end, the two voices that remain in Remembering Babylon are not voices, for instance, of Aboriginal people that might remember a past. These are the voices of white Australians that have been adopted, well, in the case of Janet, by nature. Okay, so it's basically a white female settler that emerges as the mouthpiece, as the person speaking for the past of Australia. Of course, the bees represent a sort of primitive connection to the land. Okay, they're supposed to represent, I guess they represent that in all cultures, they represent a primitive energy. You do have the idea of a primitive sexual energy. They're drawn to her because she has a period. So that's why they come to her in the first place. But you can see that there's this dimension of energy, and pretty much she speaks for the primitive voice of the land in a way. She represents that, having been adopted by the bees. So even though this is a bit, pushing sort of literary devices, this is what you do have in the novel, and in the novel you do have a transfer of knowledge on the land that goes pretty much from Jemmy representing Aborigines to the settlers. And it's Jemmy that basically enables the settlers to have access to nature, to have access to all sorts of things. And it's very symbolic that at the end, it's Jemmy that validates this moment. Okay, that validates through his eyes, through his understanding of the uniqueness of the situation, what happened. Don't forget that Jemmy represents the Aboriginal figure in this. Okay, so you've got a symbolic transfer, a symbolic recognition of Janet as being part and parcel of the land through that. Ça va? Une petite pause. À tout de suite.
Ouais, absolument. C'est pour ça que je suis choqué. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Ils disent jusqu'à minuit.
Présentation entreprise lambda.
Tu vois, on appelle c'est juste ça commence avec
Normalement, dès que tu as une date dans le passé, c'est passé quand même également. Ça se passe dans les années 1950, évidemment, c'est après, c'est vrai qu'il y a des choses qui passent à l'aéroport. Voilà, c'est gentil. C'est vrai que ça fait un peu bizarre des fois quand on dit dans le château de feu, le narrateur, enfin, c'est bizarre, ça fait chier. Ouais, faut vraiment juste assurer que grammaticalement, c'est plus en anglais dans les générations. Parce que dès que tu as une date dans le passé, il faut obligatoirement que en fait, dès que tu passes sur les deux, c'est dans le passé. Ou avec des actes ici, et ensuite c'est dans le passé dans le
Dans les livres, le livre avait
c'était pas en... Okay, let's start again. All right. So what we're going to do for the rest of our time together today is to work on a dissertation topic on remembering Babylon. A nasty one is where you can handle the one that you actually get at the exam. So, you know that for your dissertation you can get a notion. I can also ask you to work from a quote. So let's pretend I'm asking you to work on this quote. This is from the Otto article. This one, Jamie serves as a locus. Locus, c'est comme place or location, and catalyst for certain kinds of disorientation intrinsic to the colonial experience. Miam miam. C'est écrit ici. Je vous laisse 5 minutes pour décortiquer ce qu'il faut faire de ça. Ensuite on en parle et ensuite on cherche des idées. Mais d'abord on décortique. Plus on fait du en cours, plus c'est simple le jour d'examen. Okay? Non, je vous donnerai pas ça le jour d'examen. Okay? Pour pratiquer. Discuss. Je vous laisse décomposer. Comme on avait fait la dernière fois, que veulent dire les mots, quels sont les mots importants. On vous demande de réfléchir à quoi. Enfin, je vous demande de réfléchir à quoi.
multiple for getting it's a color disorientation in.
Let's see. What am I asking you to do? Or what are some of the words you isolated and you defined? Let's do this in a random order. Complete silence. Okay. What are some of the elements you broke down, or some of the elements that you found problematic? I could see people looking up words. I'm not sure which words you were looking up.
What I understand is this statement is saying that Jemmy sort of embodies two things: the place, so the sort of border place is
Okay.
the in-between, as we said, is the fence, and a catalyst for a certain kind of disorientation. So it's a bit tricky, but is the unknown and the known in the same? Again, the in-between, but the psychological in-between. Intrinsic to the colonial experience, related to colonial experience, so the meeting between two civilizations.
Okay. Alright. I agree with one thing. The first thing is that this quote is asking you to reflect about two things. First, the idea of Jemmy as locus, and secondly, the idea of Jemmy as catalyst for the same thing. Hey, we're talking about one thing and then we'll deconstruct what that is. But you need to reflect, if you're supposed to work on this, about Jemmy as a locus. Ici j'ai traduit par place, location, but locus means basically as, the place. I think here you can equate this with character. Okay, so basically Jemmy is the, I'm not sure how to formulate this, but basically Jemmy is where in the novel Maloof is talking about this, Maloof is symbolizing this. Okay, so I wouldn't interpret it literally as you did as a location. Jemmy's not a location, Jemmy's a character where Maloof is basically putting all sorts of things and playing out all sorts of things for this. Okay, so I would basically think about Jemmy as a character. And Jemmy in the novel as a catalyst, that is thinking both. You need to think about the two technically if you're going to analyze this properly. Okay, so Jemmy as a locus, Jemmy as a catalyst for the rest of what we'll talk about.
Jemmy is like a tool to talk about the colonial experience?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much that's what the quote mentions, that Jemmy is used as a device, if you want, literary prop almost, to speak about the colonial experience. Okay, so this is what you need to think about. Is Jemmy, well, non, on va pas mettre ça comme ça. Is the character of Jemmy the place, well, the location in the novel of disorientations intrinsic to the colonial experience? Does he work as a catalyst for disorientations intrinsic to the colonial experience? Okay, so it's the idea of thinking about how Jemmy might be a symbol or might be accelerating for some other characters this idea of the colonial experience. Okay, so you need to consider these two functions. D'accord, la citation, elle vous indique que Jemmy fonctionne comme deux choses différentes. D'accord, c'est le lieu, on va dire je n'arrive pas à trouver de mots qui conviennent, mais c'est le personnage où vous avez ce type de désorientation qui sont représentées et c'est un catalyseur pour ça dans le roman. Donc dans votre dissertation, il faut absolument essayer de voir si oui, il a ces deux fonctions-là, peut-être qu'il y en a une qui domine plus que l'autre, ou une qui pour vous n'est pas vraie, ou une autre où il manque une dernière fonction, où il faut plus développer, etc. D'accord? Donc on vous demande vraiment de réfléchir à ces deux fonctions-là. Maintenant, il nous reste ça. So, what do you make of this? Certain kinds of disorientation intrinsic to the colonial experience. What's that refer to? Or what's that mean?
Those settlers that they lost their sense of direction.
The sense of direction.
I mean, they don't belong. They don't belong to that place that they are in.
Yep. Okay. All right. So I guess we can speak about identity, or as you said, belonging. What else would you include here? Or how else do you explain this? You're basically being asked to think about the colonial experience. Within the colonial experience, to think about what is characteristic, what disorientations are characteristic of the colonial experience, that is within someone's experience that is part of colonialism, what is going to be a characteristic disorientation. So we can include this, Tilly?
Just focusing about colonial experience, and just maybe it's about at the same time suppressing a society and creating a new one.
Okay. Okay. Just trying to. I'm just trying to connect this to this, because here, I guess the disorientation deal with individuals rather than society as a whole. But as you said, I guess there's a tension between guilt and the desire to create something new. So I don't know. I guess we talked about replacing, creating, and potentially the tensions that are connected to this.
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking about that as a link to what you said about Babylon, actually.
Okay.
Like creation of a new society, and at the same time, it's just destruction by a spiritual entity, which here is kind of human nature.
Okay. How would you connect it to the topic, like?
Well, if it's human nature that destroyed the newly created society, it's actually the catalyst of this is the character of Jenny.
Is one of Jim?
Jenny itself. Its character itself.
Okay. Okay. I see what you mean. I'm not sure how to translate it onto the board, but I see what you mean.
I mean, the way that people see Jimmy is actually making them think about is he trustworthy? Is the whole family helping him trustworthy? And just, I don't know, just when you question the trust of everyone, it's just that society that explodes.
Yeah, okay, alright, I guess this could be an argument in the catalyst if you consider this dimension, if you consider whether Gem is a catalyst for this. Okay. What else can I list under the disorientations that are typical of the colonial experience? You need to think about this in global terms before you can think about applying it to the novel. That's the problem with a dissertation topic. You have to try to think about all sorts of disorientations created by the colonial experience, and then try to see which ones exist in remembering Babylon. So what would you list? Let's say tomorrow you guys are migrating to India. What are some disorientations that you're going to face? Ready?
Regarding communication.
Sorry,
Regarding communication, it depends language.
yeah, okay. Alright, so communication, potentially language. What else? Yeah?
The land.
Okay. What about the land?
So
maybe you don't know whether there are tigers or snakes in India, so you're in the shits. You have to make sure that you do this properly. What else when you move to India?
Cultural stuff.
Yeah, okay, so cultural references, potentially. What else can you think about? Let me see. Oh my god, pretty good. Communication. Any other thoughts? Really?
Social fracture.
Social?
Social fracture.
Fracture.
Like.
Gap. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Should I put in culture or do you want to separate the slot? Social gaps. So different cultures, different things like that. Qu'est-ce qu'on a mis? I guess we can add maybe something like otherness and the definition of self. So, if we stop here, you can see that we've got 5 points. In the colonial experience, you've got certain forms of disorientation that are typical. We identified roughly those. Okay, so communication, there are changes in communication in language, perhaps you don't know the land, so you're going to have a sort of disorientation. Obviously, what you're being asked to think about is whether Jemmy is basically a symbol. A symbol or the location in the novel for these disorientations. Does he work as a symbol for this? And is he a catalyst for the disorientation of other characters? Je vous laisse quelques petites minutes pour essayer de réfléchir à un ou deux arguments, un ou deux éléments de réponse, et puis on regarde ça ensemble. Vous pouvez prendre l'un ou l'autre, voyez un peu si vous avez des idées d'exemples, on en a mentionné un avant, voir ce qu'on pourrait faire intervenir là-dedans.
We were talking about the otherness and the sort of identity crisis. We talked earlier about the fact that Jamie was a sort of in-between person. So the settlers questioned themselves about his identity. Is he a spy? Is he just a dumb guy? Is he? So he's questioning a lot of things about society and about civilization. So he's a pretty good catalyst about the identity crisis.
It's a stress on the first one.
Yes, yeah. Catalyst, yeah.
Okay, alright, so one argument for the catalyst section. Okay, thank you. Sylvie?
I'll just add something that you just said. It's also that the thing is running away, Jim is running away from one part of his identity, is running away from the Aborigine part at the beginning, and then at the end he's running away from the English part. So in a way that may be seen as a representation of his own identity.
Okay, so you shift this in?
Catalyst, I think.
Sure. I'll put it here. Because he's talking about his own identity as a character. If he's a catalyst, it means that he's accelerating something for another character. Okay, alright. Okay, I agree with you. I guess Jemmy is pretty disorientated in terms of his connection to his own past. You've got the past in England, you've got the past on the boat, you've got the past with Aborigines. Obviously, you can think about how this disorientation is shown. You've got the fact that Jemmy doesn't actually say much about his past. We've got bits, fragments of his past through nightmares, through moments. It's very difficult to actually see what his memories actually are. Okay, so as a whole, he's a very disorientated character. He's got no sense of identity, no really coherent sense of the past. D'accord? Vous pourriez imaginer un moment où on vous fait le chapitre, où on vous explique tout son passé. Là, c'est pas tellement ça, c'est de temps en temps on a des petites choses, même à la fin on ne sait pas trop, il y a tel personnage, il y a tel autre, tout reste assez ambigu. C'est aussi la perception d'un enfant de ce qui lui est arrivé, donc on a plein de problèmes par rapport à ça. D'accord? Donc c'est possible de dire que lui, sa perception de son propre passé, elle est caractérisée par un manque d'orientation, c'est bizarre de dire ça, qui vient de sa situation coloniale. Alright. What else have you thought about?
Well, we talked about it, the beats, actually, the whole passage, and especially the ends, when Jenny is the one that acknowledges the change of hands within China. It's actually is a catalyst of another language that many say that it's language of nature, maybe, but there's just the only two that can speak it at the end, through eyes.
Okay. My question is this a disorientation?
Maybe I will say the same thing, but I will use another example, Mr. Fraser's one. Jemmy is a bridge to help understand an unknown nature.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the rest of it.
Yes, because he's showing Mr. Fraser some plans, and so maybe he's a sort of guide through this unknown nature. So I will use it as a catalyst.
I see what you guys mean, and I agree with both your points. What I'm trying to get at is the fact that this quote says Jemmy catalyzes certain types of disorientations. That is, he generates disorientation. He facilitates this.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is that your arguments actually go almost the opposite way. That he's making sense of that world for them. So these could be arguments to challenge the quote. Okay, saying no, Jemmy's not generating disorientation. Jemmy's actually giving a frame. He's making sense of the world. Through the example that you gave, through Janet, and through the example of Mr. Fraser, he's this bridging figure, and therefore he's not just a form of disorientation. He's actually someone who's helping the community, at least some characters in the community, come to terms with it. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Je sais que ça fait mal aux cheveux, mais on va y arriver. What else have you thought about? Okay, I was trying to think about it in connection to the quote and what you can question what the quote actually says. The quote says, Jemmy, disorientation, whether it's disorientation within him or disorientation he generates for others. And obviously we can find an example of him not generating disorientation, but generating actually quite the opposite. Okay, so you can say, well, no, we can question Otto's argument here when we think about these examples.
Can we say it's not about because of him, it's because of the seller, they think like that? Because as for Jamie's, for me, Jamie represents the true nature because he has this childish behavior.
Yeah.
So he serves as a nature and an unknown nature for a settler. So when a human goes to unknown nature, they don't know what to do because they have this fear. They don't know that place. So for them, they make this disorientation. It's not Jamie that's creating this thing for them. It's the seller that they're creating this situation for themselves because they don't know that.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
I see your point. What I'm going to ask you to do is to formulate it in connection to this. That is, are you questioning something? Are you saying it's not a catalyst but something else? How do you connect it back to the topic? I agree with your point.
Yeah. That's the problem, I don't know.
That's what you need to do. Always go back to the topic and try to say how your argument connects with it.
Okay.
So, this will depend whether your argument fits into this or not. It will depend on how you define a catalyst. If you consider that a catalyst is something where you've got a situation and they're just accelerating something that already exists, or they're adding something that is going to trigger something that did not exist before, depending on how you define it, whether you define it in a very open way or not, you can include it in it. Un catalyseur, techniquement, c'est à vous de voir comment vous définissez. Si il y a une situation donnée, le catalyseur fait que cette situation se développe et qu'elle a toujours eu ça en elle, ou alors que le catalyseur, il y a une situation donnée, il faut rajouter quelque chose qui fait que ça fait exploser. Donc il faut penser à définir vos termes, c'est ça qui vous permet de faire ça. But say, if you say that a catalyst is adding something and triggering a reaction, as you said, you perceive the village's reactions as being there, them waiting in a way to apply their anxieties onto something, and there's the figure of Jemmy and applied onto it. You can try to say, well, he doesn't function as a catalyst, he functions as, I don't know, a revealing character or something like that. But try always to think that you're here to correct or to adapt the quote. Okay, so the quote, you can get rid of things, you can say this is not accurate, and you can add things. You can say, well, yes, these two functions are there, but I can identify one other one, or two other ones, or this one is not precise enough. I'm going to need to ask the idea of revealing something. Okay, so it's up to you. Ça dépend beaucoup de la façon dont vous définissez les termes au départ. C'est pour ça qu'on vous demande de le faire. Ça vous permet de réfléchir en des termes précis. Et après, comme je disais, là, cet argument-là, on peut le placer là-dedans selon comment on a défini ça. Sinon, on peut y réfléchir en termes de révélation, je sais pas, vous pouvez même passer par le scapegoat theory. D'accord? Scapegoat en français. Je sais pas. Je sais plus. Carmela, dans 2 minutes. Alright. What else did you think about? Any other arguments? So we've spoken a little bit about the catalyst bit. What about Jemmy as a symbol of disorientation? We've spoken about the past. Are there any other things you've thought about as symbolizing or maybe not symbolizing disorientation, or of that not being connected to the colonial experience?
The language is, he doesn't speak English properly, and we don't know if he speaks any other language properly.
Yeah.
And he doesn't speak much, really. So that's a problem. Well, he has a problem. I mean, yeah, that's a problem for sure. But the problem of communication, of you can't interact properly, and that's sort of, yeah, number one, locus.
Yeah,
So he's a
okay.
symbol of this problem of communication with the other.
Yeah, definitely. I guess you could read him, as you said, as a symbol of having trouble communicating. He's gone through so many experiences as a victim of colonialism and domination and oppression that he's lost the ability to regain his own language. If you hate the character of Jemmy, you can give a different interpretation to it, saying, this is not the result of colonial experience, this is the result of stupidity. The man is stupid in the first place. Whether or not he was oppressed is just plain stupid. So it's up to you to see how you interpret the character of Jemmy. Anything you demonstrate perfectly, I cannot refuse. Okay? So back up your arguments and demonstrate. Take examples, quote the novel, got a dissertation. This way you know that you can back up your arguments. I think here the main idea is to demonstrate that there is disorientation in the character of Jemmy. Okay, you need to demonstrate this at some point. The question I think that is problematic is you need to wonder whether this disorientation comes from the colonial experience or if it's connected to something else. If you think about the London experience and the trauma of the London experience, that's got nothing to do with colonial experience. Or, depending on how you define colonial, maybe you define it as oppression or whatever, but strictly speaking, it's not colonial experience. So you can also think about the disorientations that exist in Jemmy, and the fact that a lot of these disorientations come from oppression or poverty, but not necessarily the specificity of the colonial experience. Okay, so this is one way you can question the quote that is here. Yes, and then for the catalyst thing, of course, you would need to demonstrate that he's creating disorientations for others. Okay, so we're still centering on that idea of disorientation. What types of disorientation is he creating? You can think about all of the tensions within the community. C'est vrai que quand il arrive, il y a tout qui explose. D'accord, vous avez une communauté qui est à peu près stable, il arrive pas, il y a des groupes, des machins, des trucs, des gens qui sont isolés, de la violence, des choses qu'ils n'ont jamais vues dans la communauté. Donc quelque part, il y a une espèce de violence dans les settlers, basée sur une anxiété qui explose au moment où Jamie arrive. D'accord, peut-être parce qu'enfin, il y a une figure sur laquelle cette violence, elle peut se porter. D'accord, ça existe aussi, hein, c'est ça le scapegoat theory. But you also have, so you can demonstrate this, that it is Jamie that basically acts as a trigger as well. Vous pouvez aussi raffiner ce terme-là si vous trouvez que l'idée de catalyser, d'accélération, c'est ça un catalyseur, c'est quand ça accélère quelque chose. Donc si vous trouvez que c'est plutôt un déclencheur, un révélateur, je sais pas quoi, vous pouvez proposer un autre terme à la place. I think what is interesting in this though, and that's the reason why I wanted us to think about it beside the practice of working on something difficult, is the fact that you can see in this that you've got two functions for Jemmy in the novel. There's a first function of him that is basically a victim. If you think about it, Jemmy is the figure of the victim. He's a victim in London, he's a victim on a boat, he's a victim of the Aborigines, he's a victim of the community, his life is horrible. Okay, so you can feel that he serves as the symbol of the victim of poverty in London, the trip, childhood, the moment with Aborigines. He's still a victim because he was with Aborigines, so he's not accepted by the community, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so he stands as this, and he also stands as a figure of the unknown. Okay, so you can see that he basically has two functions in the novel. He's that person that's going to trigger all sorts of anxieties, but he's also the victim. And he also works, si on prend nos troisièmes arguments qui ne rentraient pas, où lui il facilite en fait l'accès à la nature, l'accès à la compréhension, etc. He also functions as a helping, reconciling sort of presence. He's the one creating a bridge between the settlers and the Aborigines, even with Aborigines being absent. So you can see that Jemmy actually fulfills a number of functions in the novel. He's a very complex character to analyze because there are so many dimensions to how he's being used in the novel. Faut bien vous rappeler qu'on est vraiment dans une création fictionnelle, d'accord? C'est un procédé littéraire, Jemmy. Il est là pour permettre à Malouf de développer certaines choses. Et vous voyez qu'il a plein de fonctions en fait. Il sert à plein de choses, Jemmy. Il est multifaceted. Ça va? Alors, pour la semaine prochaine, pages 65 à 70. Donc pareil, je vous laisse lire, bien surligner les éléments principaux, les arguments principaux, ce qui est utile, et puis ce que vous ne comprenez pas, on en parlera. See you next week.
Voilà, c'est l'examen didactique du décembre. Pour l'étude non, politique à fin de cuma politik ne mi dönem? Şöyle, ben öğretmenlerle konuştuğum bir politik bağlam.